I never thought a stranger's whisper at a hotel bar would be the thing that saved my life. My name is Leah. I'm 32 years old, and for the past 9 years I've worked as a forensic accountant for a federal contractor in Washington, D.C. My job is to find things people hide, discrepancies in numbers, gaps in logic, paper trails that lead somewhere nobody wants you to look. I'm good at it. My supervisor once told me I had a gift for seeing what was deliberately made invisible. I took that as the highest compliment of my career. I tell you this because it matters. Because when everything happened, people who heard the story later said, "How did you stay so calm?" And the answer is simple. My entire professional life trained me to slow down when every instinct says panic, to collect before I confront, and to never show my hand until I know exactly what cards the other person is holding. The weekend that changed everything began on a Friday in late September. My uncle, my mother's younger brother, had flown in from Phoenix to celebrate what he called the biggest moment of our family in a generation. 3 weeks earlier, I had finalized the sale of a data analytics company I co-founded right out of graduate school. 7 years of 70-hour weeks, of skipped vacations and missed weddings and relationships that quietly fell apart because I was always working. 7 years of rebuilding after our Series A almost collapsed, of negotiations that stretched past midnight, of moments where I genuinely didn't know if we would make it. We made it. The sale closed at $38 million. My share, after my co-founder and early investors, came to just over $19 million. I hadn't told many people. My mother knew, obviously. My closest friend from college. My lawyer. I had been deliberately quiet about it, not out of false modesty, but because I had seen what sudden wealth announcements did to relationships. I'd watched colleagues come into money and spend the next 2 years fending off requests, resentments, and people they barely recognized as the same ones they'd known before. My uncle found out through my mother. She told him in what she described as a quiet, proud moment between siblings. She trusted him completely. They had grown up poor together, had looked out for each other their whole lives, and she genuinely believed that sharing good news with him was no different than sharing it with herself. What my mother didn't know, what none of us knew yet, was that my uncle had been in serious financial trouble for almost 2 years. He and his wife had made a series of bad investments. They owed money to people who were beginning to lose patience. I would learn all of this later. At the time, I just knew him as the man who had taught me to fish when I was 8, who had sent me $20 in a birthday card every single year until I turned 18, and who called my mother every Sunday without fail. He arrived in D.C. on Friday evening, and we met for dinner at a hotel restaurant in Georgetown, a place I'd chosen because I knew the general manager professionally and felt comfortable there. He seemed genuinely happy to see me. We talked about my mother, about his kids, about my work. He asked thoughtful questions about the acquisition process. He toasted to me with sparkling water because he'd given up alcohol the year before, or so he said. He seemed proud. He seemed warm. He seemed in every way like the uncle I had always known. His wife had not come. He said she was dealing with a cold and didn't want to travel. I sent her a text saying I hope she felt better soon. She replied with a heart emoji. The next morning, Saturday, I was scheduled to meet with my estate attorney to begin discussions about a trust structure. My uncle had asked if he could tag along for the first hour, just to hear the general framework, he said. He was thinking about his own planning, he added, now that his kids were getting older. My attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia, who has known me for 4 years, gave me a brief look when he walked in. Not suspicious, just noticing. I introduced him, and she was gracious. He sat in on the first 40 minutes, asked a few questions that seemed generic, and then excused himself to take a call in the hallway. Patricia and I finished the session. When I came out, he was standing by the elevator, relaxed, phone in hand, telling me the call had been his neighbor back in Phoenix about a fence repair. Nothing remarkable. That evening, we had dinner again. This time at the hotel where he was staying, a mid-sized boutique hotel in DuPont Circle. He had suggested it, said the restaurant there had a good reputation. I looked it up and it seemed fine. I had no reason to hesitate. We were seated at a corner table. He ordered for himself quickly, which was slightly unusual. He was normally the type to take 10 minutes reading every menu description. I ordered the salmon. We both asked for still water. He added a club soda. The conversation was easy at first. We talked about my mother's health, about his daughter's college applications, about a road trip he was planning with some old friends. About 30 minutes in, he got up to use the restroom. The drinks had not yet arrived. Our server, a young man who introduced himself as Marcus, came to the table while my uncle was gone. He set down the waters and my uncle's club soda. He started to place my glass of water in front of my seat, then paused and said he'd noticed I'd ordered the sparkling, but the kitchen had confirmed I wanted still. I said yes, still was fine. He nodded, adjusted something on his tray, and moved to the next table. My uncle returned about 2 minutes later. I didn't notice anything in the next 20 minutes. We talked, we ate the bread they brought, we ordered appetizers. Everything felt completely ordinary. Then the bartender came over. She didn't come with a drink or a question. She came quietly, the way someone does when they've made a decision they're not fully sure about. And she leaned slightly toward me rather than the table, and she said in a low voice, "Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt. I need to speak with you for just a moment when you have a chance, whenever it's convenient." She glanced at my uncle once, briefly, and then looked back at me. Something in my chest shifted, not panic. That same stillness I feel at work when a spreadsheet shows me a number that doesn't belong. The feeling that says, "Pay attention, don't react, just pay attention." I smiled and said, "Of course, give me just a minute." I turned to my uncle and told him I'd spotted the general manager across the room and wanted to go say hello quickly. I'd met her at a conference 2 years ago. He nodded and told me to take my time. Reached for his phone. I did not touch my water glass as I stood. I followed the bartender. Her name tag said Corinne to a short hallway near the service corridor, just out of sight line from our table. She spoke quietly and directly. She said that she had been behind the bar when my uncle walked through the lobby earlier that evening, about 90 minutes before we were seated. She said he had stopped at the end of the bar, not to order, but to speak to someone. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. But just before our server Marcus brought our drinks to the table, she had watched from behind the bar as my uncle returned from the restroom. She said he stopped at our table for just a moment before sitting down. Marcus had just set the drinks and moved away. She said she watched my uncle lean over my side of the table, not his, and she saw him do something with his hand near my glass. She paused. She said she wasn't certain. She said she might be wrong, but she said she'd been bartending for 11 years and had called the police twice before on situations she felt were wrong, and something about what she saw didn't sit right with her, and she felt she would rather be embarrassed than say nothing. I asked her if she had told anyone else. She said no. She had come to me directly because she didn't want to make a scene until she'd spoken to me first. I thanked her. I kept my voice level. I asked her one question. Was there a camera behind the bar with an angle toward the dining floor? She said yes, there was. I said, "Please don't delete anything from tonight. Don't say anything else to anyone yet. Can you do that for me?" She said yes. I walked back to the table. My uncle was on his phone, typing something. He looked up when I sat down and smiled and said, "The general manager must be busy tonight." I laughed and said yes. We'd just waved at each other across the room. I picked up my napkin and placed it in my lap. My water glass was directly in front of me. I did not drink from it. I have thought many times about what happened in my body in that moment. There was no shaking, no urge to stand up and confront him, to demand answers, to overturn the table in fury. What I felt instead was something colder and more clarifying than anger. It was the specific, quiet devastation of recognizing that something you believed to be solid, something you built your understanding of safety and family on, had been hollow the entire time. Or maybe it had become hollow. I wasn't sure yet which was worse. I thought about my mother. I thought about her telling him, proud and trusting, about the sale. I thought about him sitting in Patricia's office that morning, listening, asking questions. I thought about how he had suggested this restaurant, this hotel. I thought about how he had stood at our table on his way back from the restroom. I kept the dinner going for another 25 minutes. I asked him questions. I let him talk about his plans, his kids, his road trip. I laughed at the right moments. I refilled my water from the pitcher on the table, making a show of it, and then set the original glass aside, saying the water tasted slightly off to me, which happens sometimes in DC. He said he hadn't noticed anything with his. Of course he hadn't. When the check came, I insisted on paying. I said it was my celebration, my treat. He accepted without much protest. Outside, we hugged. He told me he was proud of me. He said I had always been the sharpest one in the family. He said my mother had raised me right. I smiled and said he should get some rest before his flight home in the morning. I watched him walk back toward the elevator. I waited until the doors closed. Then I went back inside and asked to speak with the hotel's general manager. Her name was Sandra, and she had run that property for 6 years. I knew her by name only from a brief introduction at an industry event and had never had a real conversation with her. I told her I believed something had been put into my drink at dinner tonight. I told her calmly and precisely what Corinne had observed. I told her I had not consumed the drink. I asked if she could preserve the footage from the bar camera and secure my glass if it was still on the table. Sandra was good. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. She sent someone to the table immediately. I had been seated in a corner and the table had not yet been cleared. The glass was still there. It was bagged and logged. The footage was flagged. Sandra asked if I wanted to call the police. I said not yet. I needed to think. I needed to understand the full picture before I made a decision I couldn't undo. She gave me her direct line and told me to call her any time. I drove home. I sat in my car in my parking garage for a while without going inside. Then I went upstairs and made tea and sat at my kitchen table until after midnight. The next morning, I called Patricia. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Tell me what you need." I told her I needed to know everything about my uncle's financial situation before I made any decisions. She said she would make some calls. By Sunday evening, I had a clearer picture. Through a contact, Patricia knew someone who worked in civil litigation. I learned that my uncle and his wife were defendants in 2 pending civil suits from private lenders. The combined amount was significant, more than they could realistically pay without a major infusion of money. His wife's name was on everything they owned jointly. They had not filed for bankruptcy, likely because doing so would require full disclosure of their financial situation to courts. I thought about the timing. I thought about my mother telling him about the sale. I thought about how quickly he had arranged to fly out to D.C. I thought about what $19 million looked like to someone drowning in debt. On Monday morning, I made 2 calls. The first was to a private investigator Patricia had worked with before. I gave him what I had and asked him to verify the financial records independently. He came back to me within 48 hours with confirmation. The civil suits were real, the debt was real, and there was evidence that my uncle had consulted with a financial attorney in Phoenix about what would happen to a family member's estate if they died without a properly updated will. He had looked me up. I had not yet completed my new estate documents. My existing will, drafted 4 years earlier, listed my uncle as a secondary beneficiary after my mother in certain categories. The second call I made was to a forensic toxicologist, a private lab I had used professionally once before. I asked about the glass, which Sandra had preserved. I arranged for it to be tested. The results came back 72 hours later. Metoprolol, a blood pressure medication. In a dose that, combined with my medical history, I have a condition that already causes episodes of low blood pressure, could have put me in serious trouble. Not necessarily fatal on its own, but potentially enough to cause a collapse, a hospitalization, a crisis that might look, to someone who didn't know what to look for, like a medical event. I sat with that information for a long time. I called my mother. I told her I needed to talk to her about something serious and that I needed her to listen to everything before she responded. She said, in her quiet, steady way, "Leah, whatever it is, just tell me." I told her. She didn't speak for almost a minute after I finished. Then she said, "How are you?" Not "are you sure?" Not "there must be an explanation." Just, "How are you?" That was when I cried for the first time since Corinne had walked over to my table. My mother and I talked for a long time that night. She told me that she had mentioned the sale to my uncle in what she genuinely believed was a private, loving moment. She blamed herself, and I told her, firmly and repeatedly, that this was not her fault. He had made his own choices. He had decided, on his own, that his problems were worth more than my life. She asked me what I was going to do. I told her I wasn't going to the police. I want to be clear about why, because I know that's the part people struggle with. I thought about it seriously. I talked to Patricia about it. There were several factors. The evidence of his intent, the footage, the glass, the financial investigation, was strong but not airtight in a criminal prosecution sense. His defense would argue the dose was insufficient to establish intent to kill. The civil process would be long and public, and my mother, who was not well and did not need additional stress, would be pulled into it. And I had come to believe, after 2 weeks of thinking about almost nothing else, that the outcome I actually needed was not a courtroom. It was safety, financial protection, and the clean, permanent removal of someone from my life who had demonstrated that he was willing to end it. Patricia and I prepared a document. It was not a confession. I wasn't asking him to admit anything in writing in those terms. It was a formal agreement in which he relinquished, permanently and irrevocably, any and all claims on my estate, my assets, and any financial interests connected to my name. He agreed never to contact me, my mother, or my attorney again. He agreed to a non-disclosure provision. In exchange, I would not forward the evidence I had gathered to law enforcement or pursue civil litigation. Patricia sent it to him through a process server on a Thursday morning. She attached a cover letter that explained, in precise and unambiguous terms, what evidence I held and what would happen if he chose not to sign. He called me that afternoon. I did not answer. He called again. I did not answer. He called my mother. She answered, because she is who she is, and she told him she had nothing to say to him and that he should speak to my attorney. He signed the documents Friday morning. Patricia sent me a copy with a single text message, "Done." I read through every page. I looked at his signature, the same signature I had seen on birthday cards growing up, on Christmas letters, on the note he'd tucked into the envelope when he gave me a small check for my college graduation. The same handwriting. I thought about the man who taught me to fish. I thought about $20 in a birthday card, every year, without fail. Then I filed the documents with Patricia's office, backed up every piece of evidence to 3 separate secure locations, and updated my estate plan the following week. My uncle's name does not appear in any document associated with my finances, my assets, or my wishes. It never will again. I had dinner with my mother the following Sunday. We didn't talk about him. We talked about her garden, about a book she was reading, about the trip she wanted to take to see her college roommate in Oregon. She made her chicken soup, which she has made the same way for 40 years, and we sat in her kitchen and ate it, and it tasted exactly like it always had. Corinne, the bartender, does not know the full story of what she set in motion that evening. I sent her a note through the hotel, handwritten, no specifics, just genuine thanks, and I left it with Sandra to pass along. I hope she received it. I hope she knows that the decision she made, to approach a stranger at a corner table and say, "I'm sorry to interrupt," was one of the most significant acts of decency I have ever witnessed from someone who had no reason to do it at all. 11 years of bartending gave her a read on situations that most people would have rationalized away. She could have told herself it wasn't her place. She could have told herself she wasn't sure enough. She could have told herself a lot of things and walked back behind the bar and said nothing. She didn't. I think about that a lot. I think about how often we talk ourselves out of saying the thing that might matter, because the risk of being wrong feels worse than the cost of staying quiet.